I said it before, and I'll say it again. When I get obsessed with a film, I get obsessed. I had it with Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Dawn of the Dead, the original, of course, and now Godzilla 2000. I really wanted to sit down and look at all the differences between the original Japanese version and the US cut. And I found little on it about the subject other than the audio commentary available on both the DVD and Blu-ray available for the United States version, which is where I got a lot of the information from. I had this with King Kong Escapes as well, and I put on Wikipedia, actually, for a while, literally all of the differences between the Japanese and the English cut, including Haruo Nakajima's cameo, which is cut from the English version, but some idiot took that down off of Wikipedia, so unfortunately you now cannot see it. I've made it no secret that I enjoyed the United States cut of Godzilla 2000 more than the original Japanese version, and that this is one of the rare cases where this actually happens. But I will admit that I did find being able to hear the original actors' voices really refreshing, and they all gave solid performances. I'm not knocking the dub either, because it was handled with great care, and if you want proof of that, listen to the audio commentary on the English version. They gave a crap about how it sounded and how the presentation was. And I think they succeeded in droves. It's, in my opinion, one of the best dubs ever created. All decisions made in the US cut were made not to infringe or alter the meanings or the messages and the ideas presented in the original version. They were done in a way the US team genuinely thought would help tell the story better. And it is clear they were all big fans of Godzilla, be it the campy ones or the more serious ones from the 90s at the time. I mean, even non-fans have to admit that the chance to sound mix a Godzilla film is any sound designer's wet dream. Having rewatched both versions again for the first time in a few years, I really have a hard time deciding if I like this one more than GMK or not, and I adore GMK. You see, Godzilla 2000 is just a solid movie with an interesting yet not overly complex script, great acting in both versions, and a unique visual flair. The Japanese cut has this green tinge to the whole thing, and I actually really like this. It makes the movie look dirty and grimy. You really can see the film grain adding more character to each shot. It's not even clean looking like the rest of the Millennium movies, or even Shin Godzilla, in which I think those movies look too clean. This one has a lot of grain and a lot of character. I'll put that in a hipster jar, Adam. This podcast will be a tad bit longer than I normally put out. Here are the biggest changes I noticed, going from sound design, which is a bulk of this, to the minor editing cuts made in Godzilla 2000. I want to warn you that I could literally not list them all, because if I did, I would be able to write a novel, and I'm not willing to put the time into that. But I did really notice something for the first time doing this, though. It is, I believe that the US cut simply removed the original Japanese soundtrack, the sound effects, music, and all, and just created an entirely new one from the ground up. I didn't think they did that before, and I do now. I had thought they just added sounds instead of replacing most of them, but I was wrong when listening to both versions with the headphones on. And it did make sense to me. The US team was dubbing the movie, so why not just redo the whole soundtrack in general, while retaining the spirit of the Japanese version of the film, and keeping things like Godzilla's new roar, much of the screenplay, and most of Takayuki Hirata's music intact. And I think it worked to the film's advantage for reasons I'll get into shortly. Now, to start off, I'm going to talk about noticeable sound and music changes. Now, again, I can't get into them all, but these are the big noticeable ones. The US cut adds roars taken from the '98 interpretation of Godzilla, despite them claiming otherwise in the audio commentary, which fills in the silence, but I think they did this far too often, far too much. In my opinion, Godzilla's actual roar should be heard as little as possible, so when we do hear it, the roar is that much more important, that much more memorable. The US cut has Godzilla roaring a little too often, in my opinion, which while the Japanese cut, if you compare it to, simply falls flat due to poor sound mixing. You can also notice that when Godzilla destroys the electrical plant in the Japanese version, there are no spark sounds, no explosion sounds, nothing. That's just bad sound design, and that's in the Japanese version. However, I do prefer that the Japanese version keeps Godzilla's true roar to a minimum, replacing it with grunts and groans, but again, that still doesn't make up for having several shots where Godzilla is clearly supposed to be roaring, but there is no sound at all coming out of his mouth. So, if the US cut had just used those grunts and groans designed from the original Japanese version to fill in those obvious editing mistakes, I mean, blatantly obvious editing mistakes, this is bad editing, it would have been better as a whole, in my opinion. The same thing happens when Godzilla returns and is marching on the UFO at the climax of the film. The Japanese cut has clear explosions happening, and yet there's no sound at all to accompany them, to the point it actually drove me mad. This is just bad editing, while the US version completely fixes this. The only thing in these sequences I prefer in the Japanese versions are the groans and the grunts for reasons I just stated before. The bumbled man, who is always outside of Shinoda's house and lets them live there, is given a tad bit more humor in the United States cut. The composer of the United States cut, Robinson, added a goofy theme to him, and when he keeps hitting his assistant on the head with the pole, the US sound designers added a much louder and more comical slam that adds to the comedy here, and I prefer it. It's a bit of slapstick, and it's genuinely got a laugh out of me. The music is used for all moments of comedy. For example, my favorite time it's actually used is when Shinoda and Io, his daughter, try to trick CCI that they have given them all of GPN's information, when in reality it was a fake. Shinoda says, "Are you up to your tricks again?" And then he tells Io to run, and they both do. Now, in the Japanese version, that scene is played straight, and because of the music that was added in there, it made it slightly comedic and gave them a little more personality as a result. That US comedic theme is there, which adds humanity to the scene above that, and that's lacking in the Japanese cut, which, again, treats the scene far more seriously with no music at all. In fact, that's a trait you'll find in the Japanese cut, is that it tends to be treated straighter than in the American cut. When Godzilla is spotted, making his way for the Tokai nuclear power plant, J. Peter Robinson, that's the composer's name, added an eerie track that slowly builds to when Katagiri orders the reactor shut down, which is a great scene, by the way. Wonderfully shot. The Japanese cut has no music here whatsoever, and despite the scene still being shot well, acted well, and executed well as a whole, Robinson's score elevated the scene, adding a lot more intensity to the sequence, and it builds, just like the order of events building. It's kind of like if you watch a John Carpenter movie without the score. John Carpenter often said that his soundtracks are meant to be wallpaper. They're not meant to overpower the scene. Compare that to Christopher Nolan, who blatantly loves loud, bombastic music. John Carpenter didn't, and so if you watch like the original Halloween without some of these sequences, without some of that building music, it doesn't work. I mean, it's still creepy and so on and so forth, but that music just adds so much more intensity to the sequence. It makes you tenser as a whole, and that's what J. Peter Robinson did here. In the Japanese version, the steel missiles that remind me a lot of the rods from God make no noise at all when they impact Godzilla. We just hear like the sound of flesh being torn, and it is kind of unnerving. The idea here is fantastic, because these rods are not meant to explode, they are just meant to simply go through Godzilla and to slice through his flesh. That's the entire idea of these missiles. In the US cut's audio commentary, the sound designer brings up that he too liked the idea of there not being an explosion sound, but the problem was, we see clear explosions with flames. He added a muffled explosion mixed with flesh-tearing sounds, making it fit the sequence more, and I agree with what they did there. The music used in the Japanese version in this sequence is simply far too slow during all of the action sequences. This includes the tank battle, the fight with the UFO in Tokyo, and the battle with Orga at the very end of the film. The tank battle sequence adds something far more driven and continuous by J. Peter Robinson in the US cut, also far more militaristic, which fits. The US cut also does the opposite of the Japanese version by having Robinson's music fade out as the missiles prepare. The Japanese cut has Hattori's music fade out as soon as the tanks start withdrawing, creating a break in the action, then starts back up again when the missiles prepare, and I understand the logic of why they did this. It's trying to split the two parts of the operation in two, just that, and that lack of music score separates them clearly. However, I prefer the US music because, one, it creates unity in the operation, this making it more intense and flows better with the actions, and two, it is simply faster paced, like most of the action in that sequence. It's certainly not driving like an Ifukube military march, but it perfectly fits the scenario where Hattori's music is just too slow and meandering, and is silent during most of the confrontation. As much as I like Robinson's new score, and how it genuinely adds tension to many sequences, and helps elevate them, when Shinoda is looking through Godzilla's footprints on the beach, I actually like how the Japanese cut there is no music at all. This is one of the cases in this film where I think no music was better as a whole. To me, it just helped break the intensity of the previous sequence, where it was loud and bombastic, to almost deathly and eerily quiet, as all we hear are the few seagulls and the ocean waves. Robinson's music is good, but just unnecessary, in my opinion, and they even bring that up in the audio commentary. The tank gun sounds, when they fire, is also more significant and beating in the US cut than in the Japanese version. They are just louder and bigger to hear, adding far more of a punch to the sequence as a whole. The same can be said for the missiles, the jets, the helicopters, and even Godzilla's footsteps. In the Japanese version, everything's kind of muffled and it's all just stock sounds, while in the American cut they genuinely mixed and meshed sounds to create something loud and bombastic. When the bombs are being placed in the tower, the Japanese cut treats the sequence more as a simple playing out of events, while the US cut has a music track added by Robinson to play as Katagiri gives the order to blow up the building, and Shinoda receiving a phone call from Yuki, who is still in the tower with the UFO. I prefer the music because it creates unity in the events, while also adding that things are building, and that the tension is slowly rising as Katagiri plots and Shinoda tries to figure out what the UFO wants. This is what drives me nuts about the Japanese version. Shinoda and Io go to find Yuki in the tower. Something makes the army guys look away for a moment, distracting them and allowing the protagonist to go into the building. It's poorly handled in both versions, granted, but the US version adds a loud alarm sound throughout the sequence from this point on, signifying that the 10-minute countdown has started. The Japanese cut has no sound whatsoever, making me wonder what the hell distracted the soldiers. They suddenly look up, and you're like, at what? Are they looking up at the UFO? If they are looking up at the UFO, how come all the soldiers, including Shinoda and Io, do this at the same time? The American version added that alarm, thus giving everyone an excuse to look away. When Yuki and Io try to stop the bombs from detonating and Katagiri refuses, the Japanese cut plays these sequences out quietly and as simple scenes unfolding. Robinson added a quiet motif here, adding to the tension, and even giving Katagiri more character, without there being real character there. It is when the professor says, "Don't do it!" and Katagiri turns and gives him the death glare. In the Japanese cut, there is no music at all here. The US cut has a sudden dark drone that hits when Katagiri gives that stare, insinuating there is more motive to his actions than meets the eye. Also, Katagiri saying he'll send more flowers to Shinoda's funeral, and the collapse of GPN making him far more villainous than in the Japanese version, where Katagiri simply says, "I'm not altering the plan." Adding the lines where he says, "I'm going to add more flowers," just makes him far more of a despicable character as a whole, and thus giving him more of a character than in the Japanese version. Now, what I'm about to say is why I prefer the US cut to the Japanese version as a whole. This is literally the reason why, and the track is called Change of Mind. When Yuki and Io turn the car around and go back to try to save Shinoda anyways, Hattori's music is sad and fits the dreaded sense that Io has just lost her dad. However, the music continues to play this sad music, this sad motif, even after Yuki has turned the car around and heads back to the tower. Robinson beautifully used Hattori's track and faded it into a small piece he wrote, suddenly making the scene far more hopeful, and even has me saying, fuck yeah! I just love this. It's just a little tiny addition that builds off the Japanese music and creates something better. When the bombs detonate and the smoke billows around the UFO, the US cut adds Robinson's quiet and ominous score, adding more dread and tension as the UFO takes off. Its sound design is also much more dynamic in the US cut, adding a much more poignant explosion sound as it destroys the remainder of the building, while in the Japanese version there's hardly any sound there at all. I do like Hattori's score, though, in the Japanese cut. It works better intercutting with the Millennium signals and the computer stuff, but I'll get into that a bit more later. Hattori's music is also ominous with the choir and such. I just think it wasn't utilized properly, and that Robinson's replacement music for the sequence was much better handled. The fight with Godzilla and the UFO in Tokyo has no music until Godzilla uses his atomic breath in the Japanese cut. Hattori uses Godzilla's theme in this sequence. The American cut has Robinson underscoring the scene, fitting the action throughout the entire sequence. Hattori's Godzilla theme just doesn't fit here. It does for a bit, when we see Godzilla using his atomic breath for the first time and for quite a while, but Godzilla soon gets his ass handed to him by the UFO, and yet Hattori's music remains its original triumphant tempo as before, and it doesn't fit the sequence. The entire final fight sequence has some of the worst sound design I've ever heard, from like Orga's roars to the fight itself. The movie actually looks much cheaper because of it. Having the monsters fighting with little sound actually makes the entire thing look like two rubber monsters bobbing around in the middle of a miniature city. David Callett actually talks about this in his commentary for Ghidra the Three-Headed Monster. The US cut went in, added more sound effects, added music that fit the scenes, both in terms of action and the eeriness of Orga. Thus, it made the same footage, edited almost identically the same way from the Japanese version, look and sound like a more expensive and larger movie than it actually was, making the audience more invested in what was going on. The Japanese version sound design for the final fight is so lazy, it's actually distracting, while the US cut is loud and in your face and extremely well put together. The music in the fight scenes are also different in both cuts. Hattori's music is more used to underscore the battle compared to Robinson's music. Kind of funny how they've reversed positions. Usually Robinson was adding things to underscore the scene while Hattori was being bombastic. Now it's the other way around. Hattori reminded me of what Ifukube would do for his monster cues, where he would write to underscore, not so much match the fight itself. However, Ifukube would use brash and loud music to help hide for this lack of sound design due to inferior sound mixing of Japan at the time. Hattori's music is soft, and I could not remotely call it brash. Thus, I think it doesn't fit, and actually undermines the scene, which isn't the best monster fight, let's be honest. Robinson's replacement music not only is louder and more dynamic, but also completes the sequence, changing tempo to match the action. When Orga and Godzilla get into hand-to-hand combat, the music quickens along with the cuts on screen. When Orga tries to swallow Godzilla, Hattori's Godzilla theme comes back in a key change, making it sound even more triumphant. But why? Godzilla might be killed here. Why is the music so optimistic? And the US editors thought the same thing. Robinson's replacement score better fits the sequence by making it ominous and even frightening, because we're not sure what is happening, just like our characters watching. It fits better in tune with us, and when Godzilla destroys Orga, it fades away, something copied from the Japanese version. And then, the one fucking shot where Godzilla truly looks badass after killing Orga, the Japanese version doesn't even use his true triumphant roar. It uses one of his grunts. The US version fixed this, of course. Seeing it as being Godzilla's victory, the audience should feel it too. And by God, we do, just by replacing that grunt with his actual victorious roar. Katagiri's death scream is also much better in the US cut, having it echo as Godzilla kills him. The Japanese cut simply has him scream, then it stops. Then Godzilla kills him. It seemed comical when it wasn't. It's the death of a character at the hands of the thing he wanted to kill the most, and the completion of his obsession. Thus, it was handled surprisingly with more respect than the United States version. Cuts made. The first significant difference is that the Japanese cut establishes that this first night that the film takes place is just another ordinary typical night, cutting back and forth between GPN and people just going about their daily business. The US cut removes this by simply focusing on Shinoda and GPN, which I strongly prefer, keeping the action flowing and the tension continuous. When Godzilla first appears, the Japanese version cuts back to Shinoda right after the title card. The US cut decides to stay with the man in the lighthouse, which I prefer again, because it keeps the scenes unified and continuous without a pause in the atmosphere and the tension. There's a big continuity mistake that the US cut fixes when Godzilla chases Shinoda and his team through the tunnel. The Japanese cut has the car spinning all the way around as Godzilla looms overhead. Then suddenly it spun back around for the wider shot panning up to, as Godzilla screams. The US cut simply shortened the shot of the car spinning around and where it was unnoticeable. A quick fix to a very noticeable continuity problem. And again, that's part of the reason why I prefer the American cut. They saw that problem, said, oh, well, we would just snip it. And bam, look, it fixed a genuine, blatant continuity mistake. When Yuki goes back to GPN, the Japanese cut has her wandering through a factory, revealing just how poor Shinoda is as a person. And it's also a funny sequence as Yuki asks for some help, and Shinoda points at his daughter Io, then Io points at Shinoda. That's just a funny and relatable sequence that I actually really prefer and wish that the US cut actually kept. There are two sequences where the order of the cuts are rearranged in the US version that also leaves me happy and grinning just how powerful editing is. One is when the UFO is rising with the sun. The Japanese cut's order of the shots goes as follows: UFO, Professor, Sun, UFO, Professor. The editing leaves us wondering what the connection is between the UFO and the sun. The American cut goes as follows: UFO, Professor, Sun, Professor, UFO, letting the audience connect the dots just as the Professor is. And I always love this slight change. And then the second one is when Godzilla lands in Tokyo and is marching towards the UFO, the Japanese cut goes from Katagiri saying there's only one thing on Godzilla's mind right now, to a wide shot of Godzilla marching through the city, then to a close-up of Godzilla. The US cut has Katagiri's line, cuts straight to a close-up of Godzilla, then goes to the wide. This is just a cut that always leaves me smiling because we can see immediately what is on Godzilla's mind as he marches forward, while the Japanese cut has an unnecessary break in the sequence of events, even if it's only one shot. The US version also removes many notions of Millennium because, and for the right reasons in my opinion, by the time most people see Godzilla 2000 in the States, the millennium would have already passed, making it dated extremely quickly. I do like these scenes in the Japanese cut, however, fleshing out the aliens a bit more as a race and revealing their exact plans a bit more, making them a tad more scary, at the price of dating the film a little more, however. And the reasons why was because the millennium was actually a scary idea for a lot of people. Y2K was a result. The idea that computers would not be able to handle switching to a new century, a new millennia, which is dumb, but we didn't know back then. Which is why I find Godzilla 2000's plot to be extremely smart. It's about aliens using our computers to find a way to exploit us, our planet, and especially Godzilla, which was a huge thing people were discussing at the time. How our computers could be hacked by anyone to exploit us, what we own, who we are, and what we do. When the building is collapsing and Shinoda is trying to escape, the Japanese version cuts back and forth between Yuki and Io trying to get away, CCI's reactions, and Shinoda in the elevator shaft. The US cut truncates this to focus mainly on Shinoda, and also removes a shot of him trying to get into the air ducts, keeping whether or not he is alive a mystery just a bit longer, adding more tension to the scene. In conclusion, the US cut of Godzilla 2000 is just a superior version. This is why I find editing so fascinating. This, the original Dawn of the Dead, and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monsters are big reasons why I love editing. How a film is brought together can change its tonality, its pacing, and even its message. And this can all be done not by removing or adding anything, but by simply rearranging scenes. This has also taught me the importance of sound design. The Japanese, in my opinion, have always lacked on this front, the front of sound, due to one big reason, and that's time. It really does take a long time to mix a film soundtrack together, usually 6 months to a year, and it isn't something to take lightly. It took me 6 months to do the sound mixing for my short kaiju film FM 132.9, and I'm still toying with it to this day. The Japanese rarely mix and mesh their scores and their sounds, just keeping them at one tone, and this is in the case of the Japanese version of Godzilla 2000. This has been a problem all the way back in the 1950s, like in the Mysterians, where Ifukube's music never would rise or carry over, just remaining at a constant 2% output. And this goes all the way to Shin Godzilla, where even if there is no sound other than the music, the score only remains at the same level, not increasing in volume to compensate for the lack of sound. And it's too bad, really, because out of all of the Godzillas to come out of the 90s and the rest of the Millennium series, Godzilla 2000 has the best visual flair, both with the live action and the special effects. This is also interesting because all the Millennium movies, excluding Final Wars, had smaller budgets than all of the Heisei films. Yet Godzilla 2000 not only looks better than most of the mid to late 90s Godzilla films, it is Takeo Okawara's best-looking Godzilla film by far, despite how much I love Godzilla vs. Destroya. Its cinematography is fantastic, and even though lots of composite effects are clunky, I admire the Japanese crew for experimenting with what they can and can't do. The lack of money here also explains why there are so many composite shots in the film. It's quicker to simply green screen Godzilla in a sequence than to build a bunch of giant miniature sets, which is why the film only has one true set in the entire film in terms of effects, the final battle. That was actually done on a miniature stage. And it's also a huge testament that a lot of the miniature work in Godzilla 2000 looks utterly fantastic. Great lighting. If only Toho went all out and gave the crew the time they really needed in post-production to fully flesh out this film, perhaps the US team wouldn't have needed to do as much doctoring as they did. Because the Japanese version was so rushed into theaters to help compensate for Emmerich's disaster. The sound designers and editors were backed into a corner that ultimately heavily affected the final product. Orca's roar is simply an orca whale screech. The explosion sounds were all from stock libraries, genuine editing mistakes with a lack of sound. While in the US cut, they just had more time to sit back and completely remix and recompose the sound for the film, thus not only making the film sound bigger, but also adding a more complex and enriched environment for the audience to enjoy. It's even to the point where Toho openly admits they find the US cut superior to their own approved cut. And I'm not sure if director Takeo Okawara agrees or not, but it is known that the US people did have to constantly get the green light from Toho, and Toho did give them the green light on every single cut that they made. And I think they were grateful for it because they didn't just back them into a corner and gave them an ultimatum like Emmerich did. This also helped me teach of the importance of music. Hattori's score is great on its own front, but lacks for the way it is used in the film. I did grow to like his music in Godzilla 2000 more than I had before with these recent viewings, actually growing to really like his Godzilla theme. But now I see where Hattori shines, and that's with his softer music, like Regenerator G1. That track is just amazing. Or even when the UFO is hacking into the computers, it's ominous, yet beautiful at the same time. It's awe-inspiring. You want to know what's happening, and it's very well handled. And then the end music with Godzilla destroying Tokyo, and all we hear is the choir. It's fantastic. He lacked the energy during his battle scenes, and that's his biggest problem, which is where he needed to shine. And Robinson's replacement music fixes this problem by making something driving and complementing the action on screen. I also find the US cut to be a much more enjoyable movie as a whole because it feels like a great tribute to the writer Shinichi Sekizawa, who wrote most of the Showa Godzilla films. He was always lighthearted and put lightheartedness into his films, but knew when to pull back the comedy when the situation called for it. The Japanese cut is far more serious in tonality, and this is mainly in the relationship with Shinoda and his daughter. My favorite example of how Shinoda and Io's relationship is different in both versions of the film is when Shinoda and the professor are looking at Regenerator G1. Io calls, In the Japanese version, she simply says, "I'm almost done with my schoolwork." In the US cut, she says, "I have a lot of homework. Can you help me with it?" Reminding us that she's just a little girl who is smarter than the average Joe, but still needs help. She still needs a dad. There's also a minor additional dialogue bit in the US cut that I adore, and it's when Io is making dinner and we see Shinoda reading a magazine. In the Japanese version, he simply puts it down and starts cutting the lettuce. In the US cut, Io says off-screen, "I don't hear that lettuce being chopped," making their relationship not only more human and relatable, but also establishing just how smart and independent Io is for her age, giving her more of a character. The Japanese version is just much more serious, as stated before, and ultimately makes the film a bit more like a generic giant monster sci-fi film that happens to star Godzilla. The US cut, adding a bit of camp and fun, making it more like Shinichi Sekizawa scripts, turns Godzilla 2000s into a few things. One, into something people of all ages can enjoy, from children to old-timey fans. Two, gives the film a bit of a character to make it stand out in a world chock full of sci-fi flicks of giant monsters. And three, reminds us just why Toho's kaiju films, and especially Godzilla flicks, are something unto themselves that radically stand out over any other genre, monster, or franchise ever. No matter how many Gamera, Kongs, Jurassic Parks they make, they will never have the Godzilla flair to them. And the US cut not only understood this amazing trait, but embraced it. In the end, I look at the Japanese version like a rough cut. It is the beginnings of something great. But it was the ingenuity and strong editing skills of the US team that made Godzilla 2000 a truly great and fun film to watch. Both versions tell basically the same story, have the same themes, but the US version is just superior because it has a tighter pace and stronger emphasis on sound design. Follow my website, the link is in the description below. Like AN Productions on Facebook and join Geeks for Geeks if you want to know everything AN Productions is doing and just have a good old time. And hit that subscribe button, and in the end, this is Adam Noyes of AN Productions saying sayonara.